All right, folks, good morning and welcome to our panel entitled John Brown, the City of Springfield Connection to this Abolitionist and Accomplice. My name's Ian Delahanty and I'm an assistant professor of history here at Springfield. And I'm very pleased to be joined by our panelists today, Joseph Carvalho, Daryl Moss, whom we're still hoping will join us at some point during our proceedings, and Dr. William Nash. Each panelist is going to provide a unique perspective on John Brown, his connections to Springfield, and ultimately his legacy. And as someone who has taught, researched, and written about Brown for a while too, I'm especially excited about this panel and about the prospect of kind of reframing our understanding of Brown, both in terms of his relevancy to the ongoing campaign for racial justice today and his local connection and our place in local history. So our format is as follows. Each speaker will deliver a talk and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. You can send in questions through the Q&A feature or as they come up, I should say, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible when the speakers have concluded. I'll introduce each speaker now and then, as they come up during the course of the panel here. And so let me first introduce Mr. Joseph Carvalho. Mr. Carvalho is co-editor of the Springfield Republican newspaper Heritage Book Series. He was formerly the president and executive director of the Springfield Museums in the city. He's also the author and editor of a number of books in that Heritage Book Series of the Republican. I would especially draw your attention to his book, Black Families in Hampton County, Massachusetts, 1650 to 1865, published in 2011, and his book, Struggle for Freedom, The History of African Americans in Western Massachusetts, published in 2013. As I was just telling him, I've benefited quite a bit from his research and writing in my own work, and I've brought many of our students to the Springfield Museums. And so I'm really delighted that he's able to join us here today. Mr. Daryl Moss, who's not currently with us, I don't think, but we're hoping will join us, serves as the executive director of the Afro Renaissance Art Society in Springfield. In that capacity, he's responsible for overseeing the administration, programs, and strategic plan of the organization, as well as the fundraising, marketing, and community outreach. Mr. Moss worked as Director of Constituent Services for the City of Springfield for 12 years, and he was involved in a broad range of day-to-day operations and activities in that capacity. He acted as liaison to residents, elected officials, local businesses, community groups and organizations, and federal and state agencies. And third, Dr. William Nash. Dr. Nash is professor of American Studies and English and American Literatures at Middlebury College in Vermont. Dr. Nash took his PhD in American Studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is the author of Charles Johnson's Fiction, published in 2002, and co-author and co-editor of Charles Johnson, The Novelist as Philosopher, published in 2007. Additionally, he's published a number of scholarly articles and reviews in anthologies and scholarly journals, among them African American Review and Callaloo. Dr. Nash is the recipient of 3 grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Those are not easy to come by, folks. And his current research focuses on representations of the so-called Holy Trinity of Abolition: Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and the man of the hour, John Brown. And so with that, I will turn things over to Mr. Carvalho and let him take the proceedings over.
Thanks, Dr. Delahanty. Well, I wanted to start by talking about why I approached this topic on John Brown and Springfield. Historians had always talked about John Brown being in Springfield from 1846 to 49. And then they talk about the episode where he returned to Springfield to help organize the United States League of Gileadites, which was basically an illegal militia, armed militia of African Americans to stop the slave catchers after the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law. And it's often portrayed as if here's this white individual who was very concerned about slavery. He was committed to it, but he came and shared his passion and leadership with a Black community that was vulnerable. Yes, but what my research seems to uncover is that really it's a different take on that. Springfield, he came to Springfield to work on his wool business with Simon Perkins, and it was logical because we were at crossroads of New England. The railroads have come in. The Western Railroad was east-west railroad, and the Connecticut River Railroad was north-south. Eventually, the Western Railroad became the Boston and Albany. But anyway, that enabled transportation to be able to move wool from all parts of the Northeast, which logical. He came to Springfield and set up his warehouse right along Railroad Row, which was adjacent to the Massasoit House, which was run by abolitionists who actually used to employ fugitives, who came to Springfield and gave them employment at the stables and hotel at that time. So there's a logical connection. But what we find is that John Brown came to Springfield also because we had an established Black community here of actually fugitives who came from slavery to Springfield. There were two groups of African Americans in our region. One were the old, quote, Yankee African Americans who were here 17th century, 18th century, and had been in some were slaves, some were free. But after 1780, the 1780s, when the Constitution of Massachusetts began the process of disallowing slavery, took some court cases, it's complicated. But anyway, there was a group of Yankees, but they were a new group coming from the mid-Atlantic states and the old Dominion, Virginia, sort of Maryland, a lot of them came from DC, came up to Springfield and established the first African-American church. And that became the center, the epicenter of resistance and communication and leadership of the Black community. And so when John Brown came to Springfield, there was a church already there, established with the community and with Black leadership that was speaking out against the slave power already. When he came to Springfield, he did not attend white churches. He went to Sanford Street Church, they call the Free Church on Sanford Street in Springfield. Now it's underneath the foundation of the Civic Center. But anyway, that's where he went, and he met people, made friendships, and also employed people in his business from that church. One of whom was Thomas, who became one of his friends. He was sort of a partner business, really, at the warehouse. And when John Brown went off here and there, Thomas kept the business going, and they built a friendship. Anyway, so while he was there, the year after he came to Springfield in 1846, the year after he came, Frederick Douglass, on one of his trips, stopped, of course, to Springfield because they had a Black church there. He attended there, met with people, and he met John Brown. And at that point, Douglass was still trying to find some way, some compromise this side of civil war and violence. He hadn't come to that point that it was really, there was only one way out is violence in a war. John Brown, he invited him to stay at his house, come to his house, have dinner. Frederick Douglass talks about how welcoming he was. And he said that evening, when he talked about with John Brown shared with him a map of the Appalachia to talk about a plan of how he would create a corridor into the South and a haven for escaped slaves to come and be armed to defend themselves. And Frederick Douglass opened his eyes and, oh my goodness, this guy is serious about it. And he realized at that point, his ideas about what would happen, what needed to happen about the slave power changed. Okay, so he said, well, okay, then John Brown influenced Frederick Douglass. But what we find is, in the year prior to that, in the sermons that John Brown heard every Sunday from people like John Mars was preaching that. So he was hearing this from Black leadership and encouraged to think in those ways. John Brown was talking about, we are going to, this is intolerable situation and we have to defend ourselves, etc. So that sets the tone. Now in 1849, John Brown leaves, he goes to North Elba, to a Black community there. He he was very supportive of that, wanted to live within that environment. And then the Fugitive Slave Act happens. So all those politicians in America talking about, oh, slavery was going to gradually it's going to go away. Just relax. Don't get all upset about it. It's going to happen. Here they go. With the Missouri Compromise, 1850, part of that was a Fugitive Slave Act, which then would allow the Southern slave owners to come north and recapture people who had escaped. And that was the last straw. And so the local community, the day before that Fugitive Slave Act was enacted, and on September 18th, 1850, September 17th, they met. The Black community organized this with the ministers and several business leaders, local small business leaders, put together basically a whole plan of how they're going to resist slave catchers. Basically, if you look at the document that they printed in the paper and all the resolutions they made, was almost word for word what John Brown later on, when he came back in January of 1850 to join his friends in organizing the Gileadites, the language is almost verbatim. So he didn't come back and out of whole cloth create that. The local community already had that in mind. So he joined with them and helped codify it. Some historians talk about that, the Gileadites, as what was a temporary thing. He organized it and moved on to other things. Local evidence shows that the Gileadites were active right up to the Civil War. But since it was an illegal organization, you don't see a lot of public notice about it. But you have evidences about all the Black leadership and abolitionists who came to town, made a point of stopping at the church, meeting with the leaders there. They talked about how they saw armed African Americans at the railroad station to make sure any slave catchers who came to the railroad station stayed on that train and continued on. And we never had any African American taken from Springfield back into slavery from this city because of that action. So they were very, very vigilant. The same people after the Civil War started then went public with more public activities about supporting the war effort, having African Americans serve in the Army, and then having equal pay, et cetera, all of that. But those people had been sort of undercover out of the media, working as Gileadites during the 50s. Also, by the way, John Brown did come back to Springfield a couple of times after Kansas. He came, and before Kansas, he came here, and the people that he had his business next to, the Massasoit House, the Chapins. So the Chapins who ran that organized several of the top people in town. Daniel Harris of the Western Railroad, Reverend Buckingham, which is the premier minister in the town at that time, Chester Chapin, who eventually became a congressman and was a leader in the community of business. They brought together and raised money to buy him guns. And Daniel Harris arranged for those guns to be disassembled, packaged, put on his trains, and sent west so that he had them in Kansas. So, and then of course afterwards he came back and he also raised some money again for his other efforts. So there was a continuing connection with him. And when he came to town, he also always reconnected with his African-American friends in Springfield. So again, Springfield takes a major role in his life, and because of that, takes a major role in the origins of the Civil War itself. So to me, that's sort of the importance. And also it identifies that we had local African-American community that had leadership. They were not simply followers. They were initiators, they were leaders and advocates. No, by the way, John Mars, who was pretty active in his sermons about anti-slavery and how to fight slavery, put his money where his mouth was. He was an elderly gentleman, but when the Civil War started, he volunteered to be a chaplain with one of the black regiments that were illegally formed in North Carolina when we invaded the early part of the war. There were some, before the 54th and all, there were some black regiments that the government didn't, that were kind of upset about, were established by the Union generals who were moving into North Carolina and had freed a number of black slaves. And like the 1st North Carolina Regiment, which was a Union regiment, he was a chaplain, which technically makes him the first, chaplains are officers in the American Army, makes him the first black officer in the United States Army. So anyway, but this is what, to me, changes a lot of the narrative, gives it a little different spin on it, and shows a collaborative thing between John Brown, not simply the leadership or the person that sparked this behavior. It really was sort of a collaborative thing. It was, and he was influenced by black leadership and in his thinking, and I think it helped move him to the next level of resistance. So there's my for what it's worth, there's my thoughts on it.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's a wonderful sort of introduction to Brown's time in Springfield, and sort of calls to mind to me this really important study by the historian Manisha Sinha, who's at the University of Connecticut, and has sort of emphasized how African Americans, both free and enslaved, were really the sort of on the forefront of abolitionism, as much as white abolitionist accomplices like Brown or others we might discuss in the Q&A were involved, that they were taking their cues from both free and enslaved black people in America prior to the Civil War, and really since the beginning. So thank you, Joe, for that talk. And now we'll turn things over to Dr. Will Nash, who will sort of provide a fuller context about Brown and his legacy.
Thank you very much. Before I say anything else, full disclosure, despite the fact that we all live on Zoom now, it's still not my favorite medium. So I'm going to read some and also talk some. It's just a little, it's a little odd to know where to look. So before I say anything else, I want to say how pleased I am to be here with you this morning. I particularly want to thank Professor Ian Delahanty and Lisa Holm for the invitation and for making everything flow so smoothly. I'd like to thank Dr. Calvin Hill and Mr. Carvalho for their time, energy, and dedication. It's really fun for me to be with people who share an interest in John Brown. And it's just a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. And lastly, I want to thank the Springfield College community for including me in this important day of events. And for what it's worth, I want to applaud you as a community for engaging these issues of anti-racism in a manner that is so focused, impactful, and welcoming. As a faculty member at another small New England liberal arts college, I recognize and affirm the urgency of engaging with these issues on our campuses. And I also know that the work is often not easy, and it can call on us to dig deeply, to put ourselves at risk, and to recognize that our comfort is ultimately so much less important than moving the needle on structural and systemic injustice. In that context, I can't think of a better role model to look to for that kind of commitment than the subject of our panel today, John Brown. Now, lest I get disinvited, cut off in the middle of the call, or further banned from Springfield College, I'm not suggesting that you arm yourselves and stage an insurrection or try to take over a campus building that symbolizes the heart and history of Springfield because you're unhappy with power dynamics that might be shifting before your very eyes. I mean, who in their right minds in our present day would arm themselves and try to take over a building because they're upset with the way that things are? all kidding aside, I will say that I think that the Capitol uprisings of January 6th, in some ways, make using John Brown's life and actions a lens through which to read our contemporary cultural moment a little bit more complicated. And I'll be happy to come back to that in the Q&A if folks are interested. That said, I also should note that I think we can gain a lot from thinking about how John Brown's then resonates with Springfield's now in terms of weighing out the possibilities for anti-racist work in the community, which I take to be a major purpose of what Springfield is about today and related to what we're talking about on the panel. Before I go any further, full disclosure, I do have some concerns about mapping 21st century lexicons onto 19th century experience. To frame Brown as an ally or an accomplice, or to use a contemporary term that I think best suits him overall, which is co-conspirator, it may help us understand him to a certain extent because we're making what's a really human choice to situate our own lived experiences and definitions as our metric for interpreting a story that's foreign to us. The benefit of that is that it brings a distant historical figure closer. The potential problem is that it can blur features of their landscape. Things like social roles and power differentials that are so fundamentally different that the comparisons past to present can become quite difficult. In the case of thinking about John Brown in Springfield, and John Brown more generally, I think there's some ways around this problem. So I have a few thoughts about that. I do want to say just a couple of words more about the terms that I'm leaning into, and say that for some scholars and activists of anti-racism, the difference between accomplice and co-conspirator is very, very slim, very small. What both share that distinguish them from allyship is the notion of action, rather than simply the notion of being in support. One can be an ally in a theoretical sense. One cannot be an accomplice or a co-conspirator in a theoretical sense. Those involve action. I would say that in many ways, it's useful for us to think about a distinction from the legal lexicon, which is that an accomplice assists but does not plan, whereas a co-conspirator both plans and participates. John Brown was a planner. As Mr. Carvalho has pointed out in a way that I think is really critically important, accomplice may fit his role very well in Springfield because Springfield had an African-American community that was engaged in the struggle when he got here. And I'll just say that I find your description of his work with the League of Gileadites particularly compelling when we think about him as an accomplice, the way that you put it about him really reflecting in many ways statements in the document that he helped write that had already been made by the community. So I think it's useful there. Once we move past Springfield, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, then I think we don't have him so much letting other people take the lead and assisting so much as we do having him planning and enacting, right? And John Brown was a meticulous planner. He didn't always execute his plans as well as he could have. And there's been a lot of ink spilled about what happened at Harper's Ferry in terms of when the choices he made to stay sort of violated his own initial plan and what that had to do with whether or not he succeeded or failed. Again, I can talk more about that. But I think understanding him more in those terms of co-conspirator can be useful. Now, the other terms that I want to emphasize for just a second here that I think are perhaps most important and most pertinent to the question of how we translate his ideas from past to present are terms from the past 20 years: radical compassion and radical empathy. And radical compassion, which is a term coined by philosopher Ken Lampert in 2003, is, as he puts it, a specific type of general compassion, including the inner imperative to change reality in order to alleviate the pain of others. All right. For radical empathy, there are many places you could go, but I'm going to go to Isabel Wilkerson's recent book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents, for a definition. And full disclosure, this is partly because when Wilkerson came to Middlebury a couple of years ago to deliver the commencement address, she talked about radical empathy as a responsibility that college age Americans needed to cultivate. And I was so struck by that I'm going to give her the nod, although she's certainly not the only one to talk about the term. But we can think about radical empathy as being more than just the idea of putting yourself in someone else's place or walking in someone else's shoes and taking actions that will not only help that person, but will also ultimately change and improve our society. And for me, when I think about John Brown in Springfield, when I think about John Brown in Kansas, when I think about John Brown at Harper's Ferry, I think about the enactment of those ideas. And as we understand him in those terms, I think it's really important to note, as David S. Reynolds and others have, that the kind of radical empathy that Brown had for Black Americans in the 1840s when he was in Springfield and in the 1850s was extremely rare. He may be unique in certain ways. I would say perhaps when we think about his uniqueness, it's certainly true in terms of action. It may be true in terms of emotion as well. It's always important, I think, to understand that a great many of the white Americans who participated valiantly in the struggle to end American chattel slavery were themselves not free of racist bias. Right? We think to perhaps a recent comment from Ibram Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist, about William Lloyd Garrison. It's hard to think of a person who did as much for the cause of abolitionism as Garrison, unless of course we think about Brown. But with the publication of The Liberator every week for well on 35 years, all by himself, essentially, we have someone who clearly lived his dedication to the idea that American chattel slavery needed to be ended. However, as Kendi points out, he believed that it destroyed and corrupted the individuals and the community of Black Americans who lived in enslavement. By Kendi's definition, that view of African Americans as lesser because of their experience of enslavement would be a racist belief on Garrison's part. All right. And in the Q&A, we can talk about that as well. But to come back to John Brown, Mr. Carvalho talked about him and his experiences with Frederick Douglass in Springfield and the transformative nature of their relationship. I want to read to you a quotation from Frederick Douglass when he was reflecting on his experience of meeting John Brown in Springfield in 1847. And he wrote, "Though a white gentleman, he is in sympathy with the black man and is deeply interested in our cause, as though his own soul had been pierced with the iron of slavery." John Brown, in other words, had an ability to empathize with the oppression that Black Americans experienced that set him apart in many ways from his fellow abolitionists, and certainly set him apart from most white Americans. He also enacted that empathy through his revolutionary, I would say, military actions, both in Kansas and in Virginia. All right. Now, I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I want to make sure that I leave Mr. Moss ample time. So I will simply quickly sketch out for you a little bit of Brown's career after he left Springfield, and then wrap up with a comment about how we use John Brown. As Mr. Carvalho's noted, he left Springfield and went to North Elba, New York, which is just across the lake from where I live in Middlebury, Vermont. And once COVID allows you to travel, I would highly recommend those of you who are interested in coming up to the John Brown Homestead in North Elba, New York, which is in a beautiful spot and has a very moving memorial to John Brown, and a wonderful exhibit called Dreaming of Timbuktu. Timbuktu is the name of the community of free Blacks and formerly enslaved people that John Brown moved to North Elba to join. This was a community that lived on land deeded to it by the white abolitionist and philanthropist Gerrit Smith in New York. And Brown's time in North Elba was principally occupied with two things, which was the conduction of fugitives on the Underground Railroad, and work with the settlers of Timbuktu to improve their farming skills. If you have read Russell Banks's monumental, both in terms of scope and physical size, it's about 700 or 800 pages, novel Cloud Splitter, it's a great account of the North Elba time. And I mention it because it's also a really vivid description of how hard it would have been to farm in the Adirondacks in the 1840s, because the weather is just brutal. And from really mid-October through April, it's winter in the Adirondacks. And so Brown dedicated himself to that community in near impossible circumstances. He left North Elba to join his sons in Kansas in the 1850s. Kansas, as you may know, was in the midst of a struggle over whether it was going to be run primarily by free soilers or pro-slavery forces. And at Pottawatomie Creek in 1856, after being there in 1855, Brown and a band of his followers slaughtered 5 pro-slavery settlers with broadswords. They hacked them to death. It's very brutal. It's the notion that some people cling to when they want to call John Brown a terrorist, although I'm not sure that's an argument that's really worth pursuing. He left Kansas with the eye already towards what he was going to do at Harper's Ferry in 1859. He did come back to Springfield periodically and also moved throughout the Northeast, raising funds and recruiting what would become his small army of about 21 followers. And then, of course, as we all know, he attacked the Federal Armory on October 16th, 1859, held it successfully for about half a day, and then was defeated by a group of Marines led by Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, whose names you may remember in another context. He was captured, tried, and executed on December 2nd, 1859. And between his trial and his execution, he spent his time writing letters and gave some interviews. And David Reynolds says, and I fully agree, that the jailhouse period of Brown's life may have been the most important of his life in terms of his impact on the fight against enslavement. Lou DeCaro, whose fabulous work includes a book called Freedom's Dawn, which is all about those months, makes the point that Brown, with his pen, changed more minds than he had been able to with musket and sword at Harper's Ferry. And in many ways, his ability to inspire is part of what's most important in terms of the legacy that he leaves. I think it's worth noting that Brown understood what he was doing as potentially quixotic, right? And he was more than willing to die for the sake of the ideals he believed in, which were freedom for enslaved Americans and for what we now would call social equality. I think it's worth noting that we have, over the past 150 years, called upon him at different cultural moments to symbolize different radical ideas. Timothy McVeigh invoked John Brown's name, right? The John Brown clubs, the John Brown gun clubs and the Redneck Revolt invoke his name when they arm themselves to protect the peaceful counter-protesters at the Unite the Right march in Charlottesville in 2017. We need John Brown culturally, and we have used him in different ways. As you think about him in your context of what you are seeking to do to improve your own community, I want to encourage you to think about him in terms, again, of those notions of radical empathy and co-conspiracy, because I think those are perhaps the most useful ways to engage with and honor his legacy as you move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nash, for that really important sort of framing of both the importance and also sort of the complications that arise of kind of using Brown and how we describe Brown and his legacy. I think that's a really important part of the conversation that I hope we can sort of revisit during the Q&A. And just on that point, I want to remind folks you can add in questions through the Q&A, and after Mr. Darrell Moss finishes his remarks, we'll have time to answer those, and our panelists can extend the conversation a bit further. But for right now, I'll turn things over to Mr. Moss.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My apologies for being late. I have my kids, so I apologize for that. I was asked just to speak a little bit for a few minutes about John Brown's stay in Springfield and his relationship to St. John's Congregational Church. But listening to the presentation sounds like many of the remarks I was going to share have already been shared, so I'll just stick right to the church. As you know, St. John's Congregational Church was founded by African-American abolitionists in 1844. Church became known as the Free Church, soon counted the abolitionist John Brown among its members, visited by major abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, the Journey of Truth, During one of Brown's meetings with Douglas at St. John's Church, he actually did a fairly good job in terms of convincing Frederick Douglass that slavery would not be ended by peaceful means. It was an interesting conversation. And most of this information I received from the late Luana Hood, the founder and director of the Pamusa Museum in Springfield. Had a chance to talk with Springfield residents who have been around forever, affiliated with St. John's Church, who shared information. So I want to make it clear that I am not an expert on John Brown. We do know that John Brown left, he donated his Bible during his stay to St. John's Church. St. John's Church at the time was called the Free Church, combined with Sanford Church, and they renamed the church the St. John's Congregational Church in honor of John Brown. We know that the members of St. John's, the Black community in Springfield, its members went on to do phenomenal things, which really separates them from a number of Black communities here in Western Mass and also Connecticut, right down the road. When you look at some of the things that were accomplished by St. John's Church and the members who were heavily inspired by John Brown during his stay there in terms of just organizing meetings and educating them on what abolitionism is, talking about the evils of slavery, organizing safe houses around the city. We still talk about that. There are groups that still conduct tours, which kind of point out some of the safe houses and locations for escaped slaves here in the city of Springfield and Western Mass. And a lot of that, again, inspired by John Brown. And as we talk about John Brown today, it's so interesting as we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and all the activity that took place in 2020. I was sat on a number of forums in which, the name John Brown's name was brought up. And people talk about John Brown as we talk about who our white allies are, be they liberal or conservative. And they talk about, for those who really stand for true equality, fairness, and equity for African Americans in the United States. We bring up John Brown an awful lot based on his work here, and again, his tragic ending with Harper's Ferry. In terms of saying a real ally is one who's willing to put, blood, life, family on the line to ensure that his neighbor is just as free as he is. So we often talk about John Brown, the work that was done. When you talk about how he inspired the Springfield Black population as it grew with the migration from the South, we have to talk about the establishment of Camp Atwater. We have to talk about the library, the residence, late night classes for women, literacy courses. A lot of that inspired by John Brown during his stay and his level of activity within St. John's Congregational Church. So a lot is credited to him in terms of what we do, how this community sees itself, how it views itself, particularly talking from a community perspective, how we organize, the perception of in terms of worldview, in terms of how we work to continue to track for Black equality and again, equity, which is extremely critical. These are things that John Brown talked about during his day. And tragically, these are still some of the same issues that we talk about today. So again, I don't have a lot to offer aside from the fact, that he was a member for a short time with the St. John's Congregational Church, called the same church at that time. And his Bible's still there. And some of the work that, that is done in the community is still done under the inspiration of John Brown. So that's really all I have to share. I really don't have a lot. You guys are the experts. But as it pertains to the Black community, its perception today, I can speak on that.
Great. So I want to thank all three of our panelists and invite now folks to join in with questions if you have them. I'll ask Calvin to monitor those if they're coming in. I have a couple of my own that I'm going to kind of selfishly throw out there to start the conversation. The first being, and this came through in a couple of the talks, especially I think, Joe and Will, yours. But I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about sort of Brown compared with other white abolitionists and white activists in his day. You mentioned William Lloyd Garrison, I think others like the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, Wendell Phillips, right? So how does Brown compare in terms of his beliefs, his ideas, you mentioned that phrase, radical compassion, radical empathy, right? How do we sort of situate him in relation to other contemporaries from his time?
Well, why don't you can jump in on that one.
Sure. So I think that there are ways in which, when we look to Brown, we see someone who is miles ahead of most of his fellow abolitionists. I mentioned Garrison because Garrison, I mean, we can hold Garrison up as someone who did believe in the humanity of African Americans in a time when many people didn't, and Garrison was early on, before the Liberator, briefly interested in the colonialist movement, the idea of so-called repatriation of people after they had been enslaved. And he apologized for that and said that he had seen the errors of his ways. And his biographers note that he lived among African Americans and understood them as individuals and as people, and that motivated him. So I think of Garrison as someone who's perhaps more compassionate than Kenny might say, right? But when we look at most of the other figures of the abolitionist struggle, I really can't come up with somebody who's willing to go as far and as fast as Brown is, I mean, I think that's absolutely true from 1855 to the end, right? From Potawatomi to the end, I don't think you can find anybody else. But I think to get to those actions, you've got to be willing to view the world differently. So I would put him beyond most, maybe all, white abolitionists of his era in terms.
Yeah, and it calls. Go ahead, Joe, if you want to jump in too.
No, I totally agree with that. I think that you look at the actions to speak loudly, and now that doesn't mean that there were people very, very committed to it, spent their lives, spent their fortunes to advance that cause. But he put his life on the line and took action. In every one of those situations from 1855 on, he could have been hung at any one point for all of that. And no other abolitionists got to that point.
Yeah, I think it's important to sort of point out too that Brown, we oftentimes, when he's taught, when he's discussed in kind of popular histories of the Civil War era, the violence is dwelt upon, right? But before the Harper's Ferry Raid, he had drafted a new constitution for the United States that essentially envisioned a kind of racial reconstruction of American democracy, right? So he was one who was planning on a sort of holy reorientation of American democratic practice in society. So I think that those are important points that you both make. So we have a couple of questions in the. Oh, go ahead.
I'd like to make one other point, though, too, is that we talk about 1855 on with Kansas, and then Harper's Ferry being he had to take a violent approach. The Gileadites, even though that was an illegal armed militia effort, that was defensive. That was clearly in response to the violence that would have been perpetrated on Black Americans who had escaped from slavery, come to Springfield. And so it was defensive, even though it would take violence to stop that. They were stopped meeting violence with violence. That was the first step. But you can see that's very defensive, understandable because of the situation people were in. So anyway, just thought I'd add that in there.
Oh, thank you. And we have a question for Mr. Moss. Someone asked if we could share more about the local, I think it was the Pamusa Museum that you mentioned, the Pan-African Museum in Springfield, because it's a wonderful place that I think very few of our students, our colleagues are aware of on campus. So I wonder if you could say more about that.
Absolutely. The Pan African Historical Museum was founded by Luana Hood a few years ago here in the great city of Springfield. It's a really awesome facility. It's a beautiful museum. They offer educational classes. They offer a tour of Black Springfield. They offer a tour. They do a walking tour of the Underground Railroad. Starting point at the Connecticut River. They make their way up through Court Square, through downtown, a number of areas. Every once in a while, they'll do the traveling tour through Springfield and talk about the various stops on the Underground Railroad and places where people were allowed to hide and seek refuge. So a lot of the history, when you talk about John Brown, you talk about life for Black Americans during that time period. They, again, host a number of educational forums on that. And then it's just a beautiful museum with great exhibits that everyone should take the time to visit. It's located in Tower Square, 1500 Main Street, downtown Springfield, in the back of Tower Square.
Thank you, Daryl. Next question, maybe more so for Joe, but if Daryl or Will, you can chime in here too if you have any information. Did John Brown and the abolitionist community in Springfield connect to or work with the abolitionist community in Florence, Massachusetts at the time? Joe, I don't know if you have any context for that.
Sojourner Truth spent a little time in Springfield. She was sort of involved with the millwrights, I guess, at that point. But in Florence, there was sort of a different, they were aware of each other up and down the valley. Actually, there was a Black community in Amherst too. And because of the kinds of employment that African Americans had at that time, for example, porters on the river, teamsters, and so they became actually, on a regular basis, the connector physically with the various communities. But it was really kind of a separate kind of an effort. Springfield had its own approach and was kind of very focused on what happened in Springfield. They had enough to do just with Springfield. So it's a little different. Although, again, Sojourner Truth had spent some time, I think a year in Springfield, and then moved on to the Florence community. She was an interesting, because her origins were from the old upstate New York, and comes from sort of, she even had a Dutch kind of accent. Coming from the, New York had slavery on the books till 1828. One of the first big instances of anti-slavery movement in Springfield, or effort, was a woman by named Jenny, who escaped from a Schenectady, from a slave owner in New York, not from down south, in New York, and came to Springfield, and the owner came back to Springfield to reclaim her. And Reverend Howard of First Church organized Springfielders to donate money, including Black Americans who donated to that effort from Springfield, to buy her freedom. So, New York was another thing. The Du Bois's family, that came out, a lot of the Burgharts came out of that part of New York. So it's a very complex and sort of multi-ethnic element within the Black community, coming from different parts of the slavery experience or the American experience, not all from the South. Eli Baptist was from Pennsylvania, came out of a Quaker community, came to Springfield. And he led a group of Springfielders to Haiti to start a Black colony in Haiti. Came back to Springfield because of disease, and it failed. They got ripped off by some financiers. But anyway, I went on. But it just shows that there was quite a different groups of people all convening here in Springfield, and that's what they focused on. I can't imagine, when you read about that time period, just the constant threat of the law, against the possibilities of freedom and your opportunities, must have been crushing. And so it took a just constant effort to fight against that. And you can see that the Browns saw that from the white man's perspective, and saw that the cards were all against the Black community, and that slavery was, of course, in his going to church and listening to the sermons about sort of a Christian look at humanity, that this was wrong in a huge way. And he took it to the next level. He felt it, like Frederick Douglass, I think Will mentioned in the quote, he felt it in his soul. I think it was pretty clear he did. So anyway, long answer for a short question, sorry.
No, thank you, Joe. There's a ton to unpack there. Daryl or Will, did you want to add anything on, or?
No, I'd probably say about the same. When you talk about John Brown, there were a number of meetings that were held at the Old Free Church, in which a number of abolitionists from the region actually would meet at that particular church. Between that and the Sanford Street Church, around activity in the Black community, as you know. So I'm sure there were a lot of interplay between the two. And when you talk about Sojourner Truth, I don't really know for sure. I'm going to go with what Joe said.
So I'll use this as a chance to plug two of Joe's books in the chat there. If you're interested in learning more about the Black community of Springfield and the greater region, they're great resources. Another book by an historian from UMass Amherst, retired historian from UMass Amherst, Bruce Lowery, called Rebels in Paradise, is another wonderful study of abolitionism in Northampton in particular, that would get at the Florence community too. A couple more questions have come in here. So this is, I think, probably for the whole panel. It's a kind of two-parter. First of all, how is John Brown perceived in the Black Lives Matter movement today? As a prophet, a peripheral historical figure, or an image hindrance? And I guess I'll kind of add in, or other, if you all might see it differently. So I guess the question is, generally, how do we see Brown as being perceived within the Black Lives Matter movement?
Okay, I'll jump in on that one.
Yeah.
Almost as a peripheral figure, because John Brown, in the school system, John Brown, when you read and you study John Brown, you read about this crazed, insane individual who was a militant and extremist. So there really isn't a lot of conversation. You have a lot of organizers who still bring him up and they talk about it. For those who are like committed and dedicated to the struggle for Black people, we talk about John Brown on a regular basis in terms of him being engaged for, white Americans who truly believe in, racial equality and racial equity. But as it pertains to the Black Lives Matter movement, again, name comes up for the more extreme organizers, for those who are excessively active in Black rights in all capacities. His name comes up. He's an icon within the Black community, period, for many. But when you talk about Black Lives Matter, when you look at the current organizers of the actual organization, you look at some of the folks who have taken charge of protests across the country, a lot of those folks are people who have never really taken the time to study John Brown. And again, I participated in a debate, not a debate, it was a conversation on Black social movement, Black progress, Black Lives Matter, and talking about how we go from Black power to, proclaiming Black power and then graduating to pleading that our Black lives matter. For those who are still, pushing the Black power concept, you'll find John Brown's name mentioned an awful lot. For those who are into the rhetoric of social activism and, spend more time pontificating on what, should be done for Blacks or what Black people should be doing, but not willing to take the action steps, you'll very rarely hear John Brown's name brought up. So I'm going to break it down like that. For those who go from theory to practice application, you'll hear John Brown's name. Again, in my eyes, John Brown is probably the ultimate gauge for America.
Thanks, Daryl. The second part of this question, perhaps others, I think it pertains to something that Will brought up. The second part of this question was, are there left-leaning progressive groups who feel that John Brown's actions are comparable to the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, and as such, the latter should be excused? Bernie Sanders, for example, saying that Donald Trump should not have been banned from Twitter. So I guess you can answer that specific question or address, I think, Will, you brought up, right, the sort of complications that arise, right, in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, about looking back at Brown and sort of pointing to him.
Right. If I could just jump in on this one, because it's definitely it's very much on my mind in terms of some of the writing I'm doing right now. I'm gonna tie this to a thread of debate about whether or not we refer to Brown as a terrorist. that really, I think the best piece that I've seen is Paul Finkelman's work on whether or not John Brown should be understood as a terrorist. And there are complexities here which have to do with the fact that when you try to map the contemporary definition onto what he did, right, things get very complicated, right? Timothy McVeigh calls himself a freedom fighter like John Brown, right? But the backdrop for Timothy McVeigh is not the unfreedom of African Americans the way that it is for John Brown. And so it's not an apples to apples comparison in those terms. In terms of January 6th, you know, I have been chewing on that a lot lately. I don't know that there are people from the left who are saying that because of what John Brown did, what happened at the Capitol should be excused. To answer the specific question, no. To answer the broader question, when we think about the sort of purposes for the January 6th insurrection and the role of the then sitting president in the incitement of that insurrection, that's a radically different set of circumstances from what we have at any moment in Brown's career, right? And so I don't think that the comparison really holds up. The question that some people wrestle with is the question of what do we do with the fact of violence as part of the January 6th story and part of the John Brown story. And there are people who want to sort of revert to the notion that violence is always bad, right? That doesn't mean it's always unnecessary. And if we think about Brown in those terms, then I think we can still sort out the insurrection at the Capitol and his actions at Harper's Ferry for sure. Potawatomi is a little more complicated, right? But Potawatomi is also a very localized thing as opposed to an attack on federal property, right? So where I come down is that there are more reasons to tease the threads of this apart than there are to suggest that there are parallels.
I think that there's, that's a hard, I'm not sure that they belong in the same set and conversation. I think maybe John Brown's, as an individual, dealing with how he dealt with slavery, dealing with it, I think maybe has a perhaps closer parallel to the American Revolution. That the colonists who felt that they could not make a dent in what the British government, what the king had done and what Parliament was doing and vis-a-vis the colonies, and they'd reached a frustration point. I mean, from the end of the 7 Year War, the First Indian War, to Boston Massacre, but talking about Lexington and Concord, there was a frustration built to the point where, okay, they were going to take up arms. Mm-hmm. That was the only. There was no legislative relief. There was no opportunity to change the minds of government beyond arms at that point. That's the way they felt. Now, you know, there may be arguments both ways, but that's how the colonists felt about it. And as an individual, I think that's where John Brown reached. And that's my thought about that's the parallel.
If I can just jump in quickly, Mr. Moss, just 1 second. I want to also point out when Brown took the Federal Armory in 1859, he took no weapons from the Federal Armory, right? That was a symbolic action. And historians are very good on the relationship between that and earlier actions, right? So that's another thing that we have to keep in mind, I think, when we think about him. If we think about him as a revolutionary in the way that Joe has just suggested, then it's really important to look at what he didn't do at Harper's Ferry as it relates to what the insurrectionists did do on January 6th.
Right.
Could I also add that you have to take into account motivation? I think it's completely different from what took place on January 6th. I think expected outcome is significant. Motivation is also significant. John Brown attempted to bring light to an active atrocity. When you talk about the enslavement of African bodies, families being torn apart, we're talking lynchings, rapings, abuse. He fought to end an atrocity. When we talk about what took place on January 6th, their sole purpose was to overthrow the government. So what they did, that insurrection was treasonous, was John Brown attempting to overthrow the government. So I think when we look at John Brown and we look at what took place in January, I think we're not even talking apples and oranges. We're talking vegetables and rotted fruit. So let's keep it, completely honest. Totally different, no comparison whatsoever.
Thank you very much for those really, I think important responses. It's a question that's weighed on my mind, and clearly some of our audience. So I think it's a really important issue to sort of flesh out here. We have just a couple of minutes left and just a couple of questions left to address here. So I'm going to skip ahead a couple and actually direct this towards Will. I think it's intended towards him, but you brought up the idea again of radical empathy, and there was a question about how that's been nurtured and implemented on your campus to upend structural racism. You mentioned having Isabella Wilkerson come and address that issue, and I wonder if there's any lessons that Springfield College might learn from your experience. So if you want to address that.
I will try. And I want to say that, I want to own my perspective as an individual, not speaking for Middlebury. And also note that I speak from the perspective of having taught African-American studies at this PWI for 25 years. And so I've seen a lot of change at Middlebury. I also work with an organization called the Posse Foundation as a mentor to a group of students. That has an impact on my perspective. We are trying to create meaningful dialogue in our community, as I think a lot of small liberal arts colleges are. We have empowered student voices. We have put into place structures like a lot of places. We have a DEI committee now, the Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity, which I also happen to sit on. One of the things I think that we've done best is that we have created a Black Studies major, and we're pretty aggressively trying to recruit faculty and bring these issues forward in our curriculum. The piece about radical empathy is about partly about building trust. And I think that we have made some strides as a community to be able to talk openly about our shortcomings around issues of race and social justice more broadly. That said, I think there's a sort of a cultural problem for college-age students right now that deals with part of the brokenness of trust in our culture in the last 5 years, which is not to say that there haven't been issues around trust and empathy, obviously, in America for much longer than that. But I think the former occupant of the White House and his election ushered in an era when certain kinds of conversation got a lot more fraught. And I think the ability to sort of cool down and move beyond calling people out to an ethos of more calling people in, to be able to engage with one another and have real meaningful commitment to working to overcome the disconnect that radical empathy is supposed to overcome, right? I think right now, nationally, the college age generation is struggling with this broadly, right? I mean, I have a daughter in college at a different institution in the Midwest. And I think we are trying to be attuned to it, but I also think that right now things are so raw that the challenge that all of higher ed faces means we're going to be a while. I realize that's a very general answer. I'd be happy to talk specifics off the recording with anybody who's interested. But I think we are making some strides. I'm hoping that we can have a day like Springfield is having, that I'm here a part of, in terms of a day of programming that might be helpful. I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that perspective, and I think it's important that institutions talk with each other as well as having these dialogues sort of from within, but that we look outward too. So I guess the last question here, we have 2 minutes, and I'd ask us, the NPR style 30 seconds or less answer as we kind of close is, what do you think the biggest takeaway should be from John Brown and his work? What is your kind of, short elevator pitch about why we should care about John Brown?
Well, I think perhaps his intensity of advocacy against evil, and when we confront evil in society, it's going to take people to commit to a great deal to fight it, and he's an example of it.
I'm going to say the takeaway should be, we should look at John Brown's life if we really look at him the way we're supposed to. And we should ask ourselves, would John Brown be happy with the state of race relations in the United States today? As we march through the streets of America, every 6 to 9 months, there's a brutal murder of a Black man or woman. How would John Brown react to that? Do we, is equality realistic? Is it still a part of the conversation on the table? Where does equity lie? When we look at the number of young people who are involved in, these racist behaviors, when we look at, the number of hate crimes and how they increase instead of decreasing the way they should, they're increasing. When we look at the number of hate groups that have sprung up, when we look at the fact that we still have 2 Americas, one Black and one white, what would John Brown think? And if we were to walk in John Brown's footsteps, we would begin to see each other as fellow human beings, and not just in terms of Black and white, superiority and inferiority. And that still exists in America. The same thing that John Brown fought against, the same thing he spoke on, it still happens. We intellectualize the plight of race relations in America, but do we actually put real concrete action plans in place? John Brown would never come on a forum and just talk openly and liberally about it. He would talk about it in terms of an action plan, and he would force you to draw a line in the sand and say, what side do you stand for? You have to pick a side at some point. When we look at some of the atrocities that we watched over the last 2 to 3 years, last year, period, we had a lot of people, we have debates, we have conversations, and they're cute and they're polite, but are they honest? Are they honest? John Brown was raw, he was honest, and he just spoke about things the way they were. So when we talk about John Brown, if we're really going to uplift him and remember his name in the capacity in which it should be remembered, I think we have to be honest with ourselves, and we have to draw a line in the sand and say what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable.
Thanks, Darrell. And Will, any last closing remarks?
Just that in affirmation of what both Joe and Darrell have said, the word that I would lift up is fearlessness. That ability to commit, the ability to not just make the action plan, but to walk the talk, is associated with the fact that Brown was fearless. And fearlessness seems to me to come back to what I said a minute ago about a call out culture and a call in culture, right? For young people today seeking to engage with these issues, to make meaningful change, modeling that fearlessness that moves idea to action, I think is absolutely essential, and a thing that definitely definitely makes Brown worth emulating.
Well, listen, thank the three of you so much, Joe, Daryl, and Will. This has been a wonderful conversation. And I'd invite everyone who's still with us to remain with us at 12:15. We'll be starting up our next panel. But first of all, if you could please just thank our panelists for their labors today.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.